They did the highest technical level of election observation that you can imagine. They did it well, and they got results that confirmed the official results. And then all of the members of the organization from different regions and the board members sat down and swallowed a bitter pill, because these were all people who cared about the quality of democracy in Mexico, and they cared about the quality of elections, not just in the big cities, but also in the rural areas. And they had to write a report on their findings, in which they found that the election results were basically correct, but that there were really serious problems in the countryside that didn't allow every Mexican citizen an equal opportunity to participate in their democratic process. So they wrote this report, which is a very good report. It's good reading. It's detailed, it's nuanced, it's faithful to what they felt was the reality of Election Day. And they said, what we experienced were two elections. One in the more urban parts of the country and one in the rural. And half our population is still disenfranchised. But what was taken from their report was, we have no concrete evidence that the vote should be overturned. And so, Cedillo won. And he won with a wide enough margin that, even counting up the incidents that they'd been able to document on Election Day, it wouldn't have changed anything. 2000 was similar in a different way. Vicente Fox won. The opposition won the presidency for the first time. And the PRI, the party that had been in power for so many years, that night was stalling on conceding the result. But what had happened to the PRI was what had happened to the opposition in 1994. The difference was so wide that even if the PRI had been able to detect any type of anomaly, which they really weren't arguing was the case, unlike 1994, it was not going to be enough to overturn the outcome of elections. So even really good election monitoring doesn't do anything to results acceptance when the margin's too wide to protest. Even when you monitor really, really well, you're only monitoring at the margins. But then the problem is, in 2006, the presidential elections, which ended up being a race, really close race between the two principal opposition parties, the PRI was out of the picture for the time, were too close to call. So even Alianza Cívica's, again, well done, statistically significant parallel vote tabulation, all it confirmed was that, yes, indeed, this election's too close to call. We can tell you that based on our tabulation of results, taken independently from this secret sample that should be representative of the nation, tells us that, yes, indeed, these guys are within a 0.5% margin of each other, and given the fact that it's a large country with a lot of ballots, and the hand counting that is subject to checks for mathematical errors, to all sorts of different issues. It was just too close to call. So although Alianza Cívica was able to proclaim with certitude and confidence that the Federal Election Institute was correct in saying that they were not yet able to call the election, it didn't affect results acceptance either. The outcome was, you can see in this very tiny picture, a massive protest by the party that perceived itself to be on the losing side of that very small percentage and did end up on the losing side of that very, very, very small percentage. They filled the Zócalo, the main square in the heart of Mexico City, and they filled the main street that runs through. It would be, well, here it's a little hard to imagine. You'd have to say Woodward, but pick another city that maybe you've heard of, New York, and think of Broadway, and think of millions of protesters setting up camp and shutting down that street for 45 days. People literally moved out of their homes and into tents on the street for 45 days to protest this. Which leads me to conclude that even election monitors working with their best of tools don't do very much in terms of this hypothesized improvement in the acceptance of results, no matter how you slice it. So what about human and social capital? Well, one of the things we want to see, if we want to see social capital being generated, is the mobilization. You want to see people being involved in a participatory experience of their democracy. And what you can see when you look at this data is that the number of Alianza Civica observers, which was quite high in 1994 in that first effort, has basically steadily declined since then. Now, this second line, which I have incomplete data for, is the number of observers accredited. These are people who get an official credential from the Federal Election Institute to be in the polls on Election Day. And these are the numbers that the organization claims because they have a lot more volunteer labor than those who are merely in the polls. So people who are, manning the computers and receiving that parallel vote tabulation data don't necessarily get accredited. But I think both numbers are useful because, of course, if you ask the state, this is the number of observers. If you ask the organization, this is the number. That difference aside, there's a pretty clear map of decline. Now, this could be reflective of any number of things, but for the moment, let's just talk about the impact on social capital. Mexico is a country of 180? How many million people?
90 million.
Yeah. It's
roughly.
Yeah. So when you're mobilizing 20,000 observers, you're making a little bit of a dent in terms of getting more people involved in a participatory experience of their election. But when you're mobilizing 500, I keep pressing the wrong button, it's a bit of a different matter. Now, you have to take into account that particularly after 2000, when there's a transition from the long ruling party, the PRI, to the PAN, many people might feel that their elections no longer need to be monitored. So the mobilization factor may have many explanations. People feeling like elections are on the improving track, or that they don't necessarily need to be monitored because the election officials are getting better at what they're doing. But there's other reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. This is a very, very bird's eye view of trying to get a handle on social capital, though. So I think before we discard the capacity of this organization to generate social capital by mobilizing individuals, we should look a little more closely at some of the other gains. Now, one thing that I wanted to consider separately from the social capital of that participatory experience communally generated is human capital. Now, this is a finding that I hadn't been looking for when I started doing this research a long time ago, but I've seen it replicated over and over in most contexts, except for those where the environment is most politicized. But in Mexico, there's very clear evidence that participating in Alianza Civica created a pool of human capital, people who had a good knowledge and understanding of election processes that could work for better elections in the country in subsequent dates that had not been there before. In a context of an effective single-party rule, where elections have been run year after year after year by the same group of people who were stacking them in favor of a particular party, where are you going to get expertise that can come in and help run elections that will have more of a nonpartisan orientation? Well, where Mexico got it was Alianza Civica. In 2000, the Federal Election Institute, an official who was working with that autonomous election body, surveyed people who are called local election counselors. Now, these are people who are hired temporarily to run elections at the local level. So they're running a whole group of polling sites at the local level. And of those, in 2000, the year of the transition, the big transition, 30% of them had volunteered earlier as Alianza Civica volunteers. And that experience, that understanding of the election process, is part of how they got the job to be the election counselors. And they came out of training in, the idea of trying to perfect this institutional process. The interesting thing, though, for me is that I continue to find evidence of this impact. So it wasn't just an initial impact that came out of those early experiences until the transitional election in 2000. In 2009,